She sang her final hymn and vanished into the fog. Welcome to Dossiers Mystères. I am your host, Longford. I love seeing our mystery circle grow. Tell me where you're listening from today. Your voices make every case come alive. Let's begin. It was a mild April evening in St. Mary Mead, the sort of evening when the air smelt faintly of lilac and damp earth, and even the most gossipy of the villagers seemed content to enjoy the peace rather than disturb it. The church bells had just finished their cheerful peal, calling the faithful to the weekly choir practice at St. Mary's. The vicar, Reverend Clement, prided himself on keeping a respectable, tuneful congregation, though it was often said that the choir's enthusiasm outshone its harmony. Among the attendees that evening was Mrs. Agatha Pritchard, recently widowed and recently rich. Her late husband, Colonel Pritchard, had left her a comfortable sum, and since his passing 6 months prior she had made quite the impression on the village. She wore black still, of course, though with lace finer than was strictly necessary for mourning, and her new automobile was a source of equal admiration and envy. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the back pew as she often was, had come not to sing but to listen. Choir practice, she often said, was as revealing as any séance. If one had the patience to notice who avoided whose eyes, or who sang sharp when asked a simple question, that evening's practice went on as usual. Mrs. Pritchard sang alto, loudly and without particular grace, while young Molly Lane, who was said to be the prettiest girl in the village, sang soprano beside her. When Reverend Clement dismissed them at 8:30, the group scattered into the soft darkness, laughing and chattering about the upcoming spring bazaar. Miss Marple lingered a little, exchanging a few gentle words with the verger about the geraniums, before walking home under the street lamp's faint glow. It was, as she later remarked, an evening perfectly ordinary, almost suspiciously so, but by the next morning the village would be in uproar. The first to notice something amiss was Molly Lane. She had arranged to meet Mrs. Pritchard at the post office at 9 to discuss the bazaar raffle. When the widow failed to appear, Molly assumed she'd been delayed. By 11, whispers had begun. Mrs. Pritchard's car was found parked beside the green, her hat still resting on the front seat. Her cottage, barely half a mile away, was locked from the inside, and there was no sign of her. By noon, Mrs. Hartnell was seen striding purposefully toward Miss Marple's gate, her face alight with both concern and curiosity. "You've heard, of course, about poor Mrs. Pritchard," she called through the garden hedge. Miss Marple, pruning her roses with unhurried precision, merely looked up. "I did hear something of the sort," she said mildly, "though one should be careful about the word poor. Mrs. Hartnell, it can mean so many things." That evening the constable came to take statements, and the small talk at the Blue Boar turned from gardening to speculation. Some said she had run off, perhaps to London, perhaps to a gentleman. Others insisted it must be foul play. And through it all Miss Marple listened quietly, noting not what was said but what was not said. Something in the matter of Mrs. Pritchard's disappearance was not as simple as it seemed, and Miss Marple, who had seen enough of human folly to recognize its patterns, suspected that the village's peace was about to be tested once again. Would you like me to continue with Section 2, The Village Reacts Next, the gossip and first suspicions spreading through St. Mary Mead? By the following morning, the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead were alive with speculation. The mist that had rolled in from the meadows gave the village an oddly conspiratorial air, as though nature itself leaned in to listen. Mrs. Pritchard's absence was now the subject of every whispered conversation, every lingering glance exchanged across hedgerows. The postmistress, Miss Webb, swore she had seen Mrs. Pritchard's car near the green at precisely 8:45 the previous evening. Headlights still warm, but when she looked again 10 minutes later, it stood silent and empty under the gas lamp. The constable, young Tom Bartlett, energetic but inexperienced, had spent the early hours trudging through the muddy verge looking for footprints. He found some, but they led nowhere in particular, save for a faint impression by the stile that led toward the copse near Miller's Pond. Miss Marple, meanwhile, went about her morning as she always did. Porridge at 7, tea at 8, and a quiet glance through the window by past. She observed with mild curiosity that nearly everyone who passed her gate seemed to be walking somewhere. They had no real reason to be, an unmistakable sign that the village was restless. Curiosity, she often mused, was like ivy. Once it took hold, it grew over everything. At 9:30, Mrs. Hartnell arrived again, clutching her handbag as though it contained evidence. "It's a dreadful thing, Jane," she began without preamble, settling herself in Miss Marple's armchair before being invited. "Simply dreadful. They say the police found her brooch on the ground near the green, her sapphire one, you know, the piece she wore to the harvest supper last year. It's broken, a sure sign of a struggle," I said. "Didn't I say, Henry, that woman would come to a sticky end?" "Indeed you did," Miss Marple murmured, setting down her knitting. "Though I wonder if you considered how many people in St. Mary Mead own sapphire brooches. Or indeed how many women remove them when driving." Mrs. Hartnell pursed her lips. "You think it means nothing." "Not nothing," said Miss Marple, her eyes thoughtful. "Just something else, perhaps." That afternoon brought further commotion. Inspector Craddock, summoned from Much Benham, arrived in a state of brisk determination. He was a man Miss Marple knew well enough. She had, after all, been of some minor assistance, as he had once put it, in 2 previous cases involving missing persons and unfortunate poisons. He greeted her with the faintly resigned courtesy of one who knew that her quiet observations were likely to be more useful than half his men's reports. "I thought you might drop by, Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat as he stood at her gate. "I rarely resist a puzzle." "Inspector," she replied with a faint smile, "though I do hope this one isn't too unpleasant." "Unpleasant enough," he admitted. Mrs. Pritchard left choir practice about 20 minutes before the rest. No one saw her after that. Her car is still where she left it. Handbag missing, no sign of struggle inside. We've checked the cottage. Doors locked, no forced entry. And—" he hesitated, glancing toward the lane. "Her maid Lucy insists she heard footsteps in the garden around 9, but assumed it was her mistress returning." Miss Marple nodded gently. "It's extraordinary how often people assume what they most wish to believe," she said. Craddock sighed. "If you ask me, she might have gone to meet someone. There's talk she'd been keeping company with that Mr. Denning from the solicitor's office." "Yes, I had heard something of that," Miss Marple said, her tone as mild as the afternoon sun. "Though I rather think Mr. Denning's affections are of the financial sort." The inspector gave her a dry look. "Meaning?" "Meaning," Miss Marple replied, "that when one lends money, affection is very easily feigned." By evening the gossip had reached fever pitch. The women at the grocer's counter traded theories with the solemn conviction of jurors. Mrs. Price Ridley declared that the widow had fled with her savings to Monte Carlo. Old Mr. Toms insisted it was gypsies, and young Molly Lane, pale and red-eyed, could only say over and over, "She wouldn't just vanish. She was supposed to meet me." She never breaks her word. Miss Marple observed Molly closely that evening when she called at the girl's cottage. The young woman sat twisting her handkerchief between trembling fingers, her fair hair disordered from crying. "I know they all think I'm being silly," Molly said. "But she was kind to me, Miss Marple. Ever since Mother died, she's looked after me, gave me that position helping her with correspondence and errands. She told me only last week she'd found something terribly important in the Colonel's old papers. She wouldn't say what it was, only that she meant to speak to someone about it." "That's interesting," Miss Marple said softly. "Did she seem frightened?" "No, excited. But she said something else too, something strange. She said, 'It's curious, Molly, how even the dead can ruin you if you let them.'" Miss Marple sat very still. Outside, the sound of the wind shifted through the lilacs like a sigh. "And she didn't explain what she meant by that?" Molly shook her head. "No. And then the next day she went to choir practice, same as always. When Miss Marple took her leave, she paused by the gate. The evening mist had thickened again, curling low across the green. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked. She stood listening for a long while before turning home. That night she could not sleep easily. Her mind turned over the small details that had surfaced like crumbs on a tablecloth. The parked car, the broken brooch, the remark about the dead. People, she thought, were creatures of habit. Mrs. Pritchard especially so. For her to leave her car unlocked and vanish was not merely strange, it was out of character. And yet, what was character but the sum of small choices made over time? The next morning brought a new complication. At dawn, one of the local boys fishing near Miller's Pond found something half buried in the reeds. A lady's handbag, damp but intact. Inside were Mrs. Pritchard's spectacles, a lace handkerchief and an envelope torn cleanly in half. Only one word remained legible on it: testament. Inspector Craddock was at once certain it referred to a will. Could mean she was changing it, he muttered, tapping his notebook. Plenty of motive there if someone stood to lose out. Miss Marple merely nodded, her gaze on the torn edge of the paper. Curious, she said, how some people tear things neatly and others violently. This was done with care, like one who intends to keep both halves. They searched the area near the pond but found nothing more. By midday clouds gathered, and a heavy drizzle began to fall. The village, so lively with speculation the day before, now seemed subdued, its chatter dampened by uncertainty. Miss Marple took tea alone, staring absently at the steam curling from her cup. Her mind was already assembling a pattern. The conversation with Molly, the mention of Colonel Pritchard's papers, the careful tearing of a document. People so rarely disappear without reason. Often they are made to, and sometimes those who make them vanish are not the ones who seem most capable of violence. Late that afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the church. Inside, the scent of lilies lingered from the Sunday service. She sat quietly in the back pew, eyes moving over the empty choir stalls. How ordinary everything seemed, the hymn books neatly stacked, the music sheets fluttering faintly in a draught. Yet it was here that Mrs. Pritchard had last been seen alive. And it was here, perhaps, that something or someone had changed her fate. As she rose to leave, she noticed something glinting near the edge of the organ stool, a small brass button, dull with age. She picked it up and examined it closely. It was the sort used on a man's waistcoat, plain but well made. Someone had dropped it recently. The dust beneath it was undisturbed. She slipped it into her handkerchief before leaving. Outside, she found Inspector Craddock waiting by the lich gate. "We've traced that letter," he said. "Colonel Pritchard's solicitor confirms Mrs. Pritchard requested a new will drafted last week, cutting out her late husband's nephew entirely." "Mr. Basil Pritchard," Miss Marple murmured. "Yes, I thought he'd come into it sooner or later." Craddock looked surprised. "You know him?" "I've seen him about. The kind of man who smiles too quickly and listens too little. A dangerous combination, I always think." Craddock frowned. "We'll need to question him. He arrived from London only yesterday morning." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the misted churchyard beyond. "Then," she said softly, "I should think he was in St. Mary Mead long enough to attend choir practice." Craddock stared at her. "You mean you think—" "I think," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "that Mrs. Pritchard's disappearance was not a sudden thing at all, Inspector. It was planned, perhaps even expected. And if you wish to find her, you might begin not with the living, but with the dead, particularly one Colonel Pritchard, whose secrets may not rest as quietly as his grave." As she walked away through the rain, the button heavy in her pocket, she could not help but think that the simplest clues were often the most damning. The village would talk, of course, it always did, but behind its gossip and its teacups lay the truth of all human mischief: love, greed, fear, and pride. And someone in St. Mary Mead, she was certain, had all four in abundance. The rain fell steadily through the night, pattering against windows and soaking the narrow lanes of St. Mary Mead until the village seemed to dissolve into mist. Morning came grey and heavy, the kind of morning that made even the chirpiest sparrows seem subdued. Yet the damp weather did little to wash away the unease that had settled over the place. Everyone was still speaking of Mrs. Pritchard, her absence, her wealth, her secrets, and now, thanks to Inspector Craddock's discovery, her will. Miss Marple, however, began her morning in her usual methodical way. She boiled her egg precisely 3.5 minutes, poured her tea, and spread a careful layer of marmalade on toast. Routine, she found, helped her think. The button she had discovered at the church lay on the table beside her, its dull brass catching the faint light that filtered through the curtains. She regarded it for a long moment before slipping it into an envelope and marking it simply church organ, stool. She had learned long ago that order was the first step toward understanding disorder. By 9:30 the doorbell chimed. It was Inspector Craddock again, his overcoat damp and his expression grim. "Morning, Miss Marple. We've been asking after young Basil Pritchard. He claims he didn't even know his aunt was in St. Mary Mead last night." Miss Marple looked mildly surprised. "Indeed? That seems a curious thing to forget, considering the choir sang loud enough to wake the angels." Craddock smiled faintly. "Yes, well, he says he came down to deal with some business matters at her request. Claims he spent the evening at the Blue Boar until closing. The landlord confirms it." "Ah," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "but the Blue Boar is scarcely 5 minutes' walk from the church, and there's rather a long stretch of time between 8:30 and 10. "True enough," said Craddock. "Still, he's smooth-tongued, that one. You'd almost believe him." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Yes, men like Mr. Pritchard are very good at being believed, but I find that truth is rarely spoken with such confidence. It prefers to whisper." Later that morning, Miss Marple took her customary walk through the village, parasol in hand despite the drizzle. Along the way she met Mr. Denning, the solicitor's clerk, who was locking up his bicycle outside the post office. He was a nervous man by nature, thin as a fence post and always appearing slightly out of breath. "Good morning, Mr. Denning," she said pleasantly. "I hear you were acquainted with Mrs. Pritchard." He blinked rapidly. "Acquainted? Oh, yes, of course. I helped manage some of her late husband's affairs." She was very precise, very particular. "I imagine she would be," Miss Marple said, "especially about her will." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Oh, well, yes, indeed. There were some recent changes, I believe. I wasn't directly involved, mind you. Mr. Harcourt handled that." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "And yet you seem rather distressed for a man not directly involved." He flushed, glancing around as though the very hedgerows might overhear. "It's just that, well, people talk, Miss Marple. They say Mrs. Pritchard found something that could well embarrass the Colonel's old regiment. Papers that should have been destroyed." "People do talk," Miss Marple agreed gently, "and they're almost always wrong in the details, though sometimes right in the spirit." She left him looking uneasy and continued toward the churchyard. The clouds were beginning to thin and faint sunlight gleamed on the wet stones. As she passed the row of yews, she saw Molly Lane kneeling by the gate, her face pale but resolute. She was laying a small bunch of daffodils beside the path, though for whom Miss Marple couldn't say. "Good morning, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "You're out early." "I can't stay at home," Molly said, rising and brushing the damp from her skirt. "It's horrid there. People keep calling, asking questions. They look at me as if I know something terrible." "And do you?" Molly hesitated. "No, only, well, Mrs. Pritchard was upset the day before she disappeared. She had a visitor, a man. I didn't see him properly, only his back as he left. But he wore a dark coat, and I remember the way he walked, very stiff like a soldier." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the church. "A soldier," she murmured. "Interesting. And what time was this?" "Just after tea, around 6. She said it was an old friend of the Colonel's. They spoke for nearly half an hour." "Did she seem afraid afterward?" No, Molly said, but she locked her study door when he left. That wasn't like her. Miss Marple thanked her and went on. She walked past the green where Mrs. Pritchard's motor car still sat, half shrouded by a tarpaulin. A constable stood guard nearby, looking rather bored. The car itself seemed almost accusatory, its silent form a reminder that something terrible had interrupted a perfectly ordinary evening. Miss Marple paused, eyes narrowing slightly. There, near the rear wheel, was a faint smudge of something, a streak of brown that rain hadn't quite washed away. Mud, perhaps, but a peculiar kind of mud, rich, reddish, not from the green itself, but from somewhere else entirely. She bent slightly, her parasol tip touching the edge of the mark. "Clay," she murmured, "and St. Mary Mead's soil is chalky." That afternoon, Craddock called again. "We've had word from London," he told her. "Colonel Pritchard's old regiment had some sort of scandal years ago, financial irregularities, hush money, that sort of thing. Nothing ever proven, but if Mrs. Pritchard found those papers, it could explain plenty." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "though not why she disappeared, rather than being silenced quietly in her own home. People who kill in haste are usually frightened. People who plan it are afraid of exposure. I wonder which kind we have here." Craddock looked weary. "We'll have to question the nephew again, and that maid of hers. She's been acting oddly, they say." "Lucy," Miss Marple said. "Yes, I imagine she's frightened too. Servants so often are when they've seen more than they should. Indeed, Lucy proved a difficult interview. She was a small, nervous woman, perpetually wringing her hands. I didn't see anything." "Ma'am," she told the inspector, her eyes darting toward Miss Marple as though seeking approval. "I just heard the footsteps, that's all, around 9. I thought she'd come back, but, well, she never did." "Did she have visitors often?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Not lately. Just that gentleman a few days ago." "And another one? Oh, perhaps a fortnight past. A tall man, quiet, kept his hat on the whole time." "And did Mrs. Pritchard seem troubled afterward?" "Yes, ma'am, she said she ought never to have kept certain things, that sometimes the truth is worse than a lie." When they left the cottage, Miss Marple was thoughtful. The facts, as she saw them, were beginning to form a peculiar shape. A woman with access to compromising papers, a soldierly visitor, a careful tear in a letter about a will, a brass button near the organ, and a patch of red clay, red like the soil near the old quarry 2 miles beyond the village. That evening, she took a slow walk in that direction, claiming she wished to collect some wildflowers for pressing. The path wound between hedgerows heavy with damp and the faint scent of cowslips. When she reached the edge of the quarry, the air grew cooler. The rain had turned the ground soft and treacherous. She stopped suddenly. There, near the brambles, was a small indentation, a print, barely visible now but unmistakably from a woman's heeled shoe. Nearby lay a torn scrap of black fabric, snagged on a thorn. Miss Marple crouched, her knees creaking faintly. "So, my dear Mrs. Pritchard," she murmured, "this is where your journey ended, or where someone meant us to think it did." By the time she returned to the village, dusk had fallen. The lamplighter moved slowly along the street, his flame flickering in the wind. Miss Marple reached her gate just as Molly came running toward her, breathless. "Oh, Miss Marple, they've found something. By the pond." Miss Marple steadied her. "What is it, dear?" "They say it's a body. They think it might be her." For a moment the village seemed to hold its breath. In the distance, the church bell struck 8, each note echoing like a heartbeat. Miss Marple drew in a slow breath and straightened her shawl. "Then, my dear," she said quietly, "I think the time has come to see what truth the dead have to tell us." Together, they walked toward the green, the mist curling around their feet like smoke. The constables' lanterns glowed in the distance, near the pond, and beyond them the villagers clustered in anxious silence. Miss Marple moved closer, her face calm, her eyes alert. The truth, she felt, was very near now, though not yet ready to show its face. But soon, with a few more questions and one very careful test, it would. The crowd by Miller's Pond was held in a tense hush, broken only by the occasional whisper and the dull slosh of boots in mud. A faint mist hovered above the water, and the air was sharp with the smell of wet earth and pondweed. Miss Marple arrived quietly beside Inspector Craddock, who was issuing instructions in a low, deliberate tone. Lanterns cast long, quivering reflections across the pond's surface, and in their wavering light lay the shape that had drawn all of St. Mary Mead to its edge. "It's her," Craddock said grimly, turning as Miss Marple approached. "Mrs. Pritchard. Poor soul. She's been in the water since the night she vanished, I'd wager. A nasty business." Miss Marple peered through the mist. "Drowned?" she asked softly. "Apparently," Craddock said, "though the doctor says it's too early to tell. Could be she slipped, could be pushed. There's a bruise on the back of her head. We'll know more when we've had the body examined in Much Benham." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the still form as it was gently covered and lifted from the reeds. "Such a small woman," she murmured, "and yet she's caused the whole village to tremble." Craddock gave a short sigh. "I'd hoped for something straightforward. But the look of it, well, it doesn't feel accidental. Her shoes are still on, her gloves too. And that handbag we found, it wasn't washed far from here. Whoever brought her here knew the place well." "Someone local, then," Miss Marple said. "Someone who knew how to make tragedy look like chance." The inspector nodded grimly. "We'll start with the nephew again. And that maid. They both had access, and motives enough. The nephew for money, the maid for fear. It's usually one or the other." Miss Marple said nothing for a long moment. "Sometimes," she said at last, "it's neither." The following day dawned clearer, but the air in St. Mary Mead remained thick with unease. The discovery had given the gossip new life. At the grocer's, Mrs. Price Ridley was saying she'd always known there was something odd about that Pritchard woman, too fine for her own good. At the post office, Miss Webb was telling anyone who would listen that she'd seen a shadowy figure crossing the green that night, though whether it was before or after the murder changed depending on who was asking. Miss Marple, meanwhile, spent the morning at her writing desk, a cup of tea growing cold beside her. Before her lay a list of names: Mrs. Pritchard, Basil Pritchard, Molly Lane, Lucy the maid, Mr. Denning, and the mysterious soldierly visitor. Beneath them, in her delicate handwriting, she'd added 3 questions. What did Mrs. Pritchard find in her husband's papers? Who knew about it? Why the pond? She tapped her pen lightly against the paper. The pond was close to the church, yet far enough from the main road to avoid notice. A quiet place, a place for secrets, but also a place someone familiar with the area might choose deliberately. By late morning, Inspector Craddock stopped by, his expression drawn. "The doctor's report came in," he said. "Death by drowning, yes, but the blow to the head came first. Probably stunned her. And there's something else. Her watch stopped at exactly 9:10, likely the time she entered the water. Then she died very soon after choir practice," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "and near enough to the church that her body could be brought here without much trouble." "That's what I thought," said Craddock. "We've questioned Basil again. He's indignant as ever. Claims he never left the pub until 10:30. The landlord swears to it." Miss Marple gave him a look of mild interest. A clever man might know the value of being seen in a public place, especially if someone were instructed to notice him. Craddock frowned. "You think he arranged an alibi?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that alibis are sometimes the most damning clues of all, when they appear too soon, too tidy, too rehearsed." That afternoon the vicar called on Miss Marple. Reverend Clement, a kindly man with thinning hair and a perpetually worried air, looked rather uneasy as he sipped his tea. "It's a dreadful thing, Jane," he said. "A dreadful thing. And to think she was in my church only hours before, I can hardly bear it." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I'm sure you did all you could, Reverend. Tell me, was everyone accounted for after practice?" He frowned, thinking. "I believe so. We finished about 8:30, as usual. Mrs. Pritchard left first. She said she had letters to post. Molly went with her for a bit, then returned to fetch her gloves. Mr. Larkin lingered to put away hymn books. And young Tom Redding, he stayed to lock up Tom Redding." Miss Marple's brows rose slightly. "The carpenter's son?" "Yes, a steady young man. Very fond of Molly, if you ask me." "Ah," Miss Marple said quietly, "that's interesting." When the vicar left, she sat for a long while, her mind drifting through possibilities. A young man in love might act rashly, she thought, but he might also be used by someone clever enough to take advantage of that love. Toward evening, she went to see Molly again. The girl opened the door with red eyes and a trembling hand. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, "they've been saying terrible things. They think Basil did it, or that I helped him." "People will always say terrible things, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, stepping inside. "It's what they do when frightened. Tell me, this young Tom Redding, you know him well?" Molly hesitated. "Yes, we've known each other for years. He's kind. He's been looking out for me since Mother died." "And did he know Mrs. Pritchard?" "Only through me. He did a few odd jobs at her cottage, mending the gate, fixing the kitchen shelves. She liked him." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Did she ever mention him after your mother passed?" "Yes," Molly said slowly. "She once said I ought to be careful. That good boys sometimes get led into bad company. I thought she meant nothing by it." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, my dear, when people of Mrs. Pritchard's age say such things, they almost always mean something by it." As she left, Miss Marple noticed a faint smear of red clay on the soles of Molly's shoes. The girl followed her gaze and flushed. "I went to the pond this morning," she said quickly. "I just wanted to see where they found her." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Of course, my dear. Grief makes us seek out such places." But as she walked home, she found herself thinking again of the red clay, the same peculiar soil she had found by the quarry and again by Mrs. Pritchard's car. It was not native to the green or the pond. Someone had tracked it there. Someone who had been near the quarry recently. That night the village slept uneasily once more. The church bell tolled softly in the distance, and rain began again, tapping on roofs like quiet fingers. Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting untouched, eyes fixed on the dancing flame. There was a thread now, a thin, taut line connecting everything. The torn will, the visitor with the soldier's walk, the brass button, the red clay, and the pond. Each piece had been placed carefully, deliberately, to suggest confusion where there was calculation. She rose at last and crossed to her writing desk, where she penned a brief note. "Inspector Craddock, would you be so kind as to call at my cottage tomorrow morning? I have a small matter to discuss regarding a waistcoat button and the location of Miller's Pond. Yours sincerely, Jane Marple." Folding the note neatly, she sealed it and set it by the door. Then she turned out the lamp and stood by the window for a long time, watching the rain blur the garden path. Somewhere in the darkness she felt the shape of the truth waiting, hidden, but close, and as she finally retired to bed, she thought of Mrs. Pritchard's last words to Molly, "Even the dead can ruin you, if you let them." Perhaps, Miss Marple mused, the dead colonel had done just that. But not in the way anyone yet understood. The morning broke with a pale, uncertain light, the kind that seemed reluctant to commit itself fully to the day. A low fog still clung to the hedgerows, and St. Mary Mead lay hushed beneath its veil, the events of the past days weighing heavily on every doorstep. Miss Marple rose early, as she always did, and after her modest breakfast, she set about writing a second note, this one not to Inspector Craddock, but to the vicarage. She asked Reverend Clement to send Tom Redding over to help her with a small repair in the garden gate. It was, as she put it, a purely practical matter. Yet Miss Marple's practical matters often served several purposes at once. By 9:30, Tom arrived, cap in hand, his manner polite but uneasy. He was a tall, earnest young man, his hands roughened by work, his eyes red-rimmed with lack of sleep. "You wanted me to fix something, Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice careful. "Yes, indeed, Tom," she said pleasantly. "That latch has been sticking something dreadful. I thought you might spare a moment before your other errands." He nodded and bent to the task. Miss Marple stood beside him, watching the sure movements of his hands, the faint tremor in his fingers. "You've been working hard, I expect," she said gently. "Such sad times for the village. You must have known Mrs. Pritchard quite well." He paused briefly, hammer mid-swing. "Knew her some," he said. "Did a few jobs for her. She was a fair woman. Strict but fair. She spoke kindly of you," Miss Marple said. "Said you were a fine craftsman. And she had good reason. This gate of mine has lasted 10 years thanks to your work." He smiled faintly but said nothing. The latch clicked neatly into place. "She was fond of Molly, wasn't she?" Miss Marple continued, her tone mild. "Almost like a second mother, I think." Tom's expression tightened. "Yes, she looked after Molly right enough. Gave her a bit of work, kept her occupied." Miss Marple's eyes rested on him thoughtfully. "It must be very hard for Molly, losing someone she trusted so much. I imagine she's been quite distressed." He hesitated, then said, "She's been through enough. People ought to leave her be." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, but people are curious creatures, Tom. They seldom leave well enough alone. And the truth, well, it has a way of creeping out no matter how tightly it's tucked away." His jaw tightened slightly, though his gaze never left the latch. "If you mean what they're saying, that Basil Pritchard did it, it's nonsense. He's a liar but not a killer." "Oh, you surprise me," Miss Marple said softly. "Most would say lying is the first cousin of killing. One hides the other quite well. But if not him, then who?" Tom turned sharply, his face pale. "You think I'd know?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that you know more than you realize." He stood very still for a moment, then muttered, "I don't know anything," and with that he picked up his tools and left. Miss Marple watched him go, her expression unreadable. She knew that tone, defensive, strained. It was the tone of someone torn between fear and conscience. Later that morning, Inspector Craddock arrived, his brow furrowed and his notebook in hand. "You sent for me, Miss Marple." "I did indeed, Inspector," she said. "Would you care for tea? I find one can think so much better with a bit of tea." He accepted, though his patience was thin. "We've confirmed the red clay you mentioned. The same soil's been found on Mrs. Pritchard's shoes and on Basil's walking boots. He says he went shooting near the quarry last week, which might account for it. Or might not," Miss Marple said. "A pity one can't cross-examine the ground itself." "It knows far more than any of us." Craddock gave a grim smile. "We've also looked into Colonel Pritchard's papers, the ones his widow supposedly found. Nothing much. Some regimental letters, a few drafts of correspondence, and one old account book." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly. "Account books are dull things, aren't they? Until one reads them properly. The dead are often tidy in their bookkeeping, Inspector, but the living, especially those who inherit, seldom are." He frowned. "You think she found something that pointed to someone alive?" "Possibly. Or something that pointed to more than one someone." She leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, have you asked who might have known she had such papers in the first place?" "We're working through that," Craddock said. "Denning's been jittery ever since I mentioned them. And Lucy, the maid, claims Mrs. Pritchard kept them in a locked box in her study. Says it's missing now." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "Then perhaps we should stop asking who killed Mrs. Pritchard and begin asking what was worth killing for." Craddock sighed. "You make it sound like a game of chess, Miss Marple." "Oh, it is, Inspector," she said, smiling faintly. Only the pieces are human, and they don't always know they're being moved. After he left, Miss Marple sat quietly for a long while. Her eyes rested on the small envelope that held the brass button she had found at the church. She took it out, holding it to the light. The pattern was simple. Military issue, she thought. She fetched her old magnifying glass and examined the back, where faintly engraved letters read RGL. She knew enough of uniforms to recognize them. Royal Gloucestershire Light Infantry. That evening she asked Molly to tea. The girl came reluctantly, still pale, her manner subdued. They sat by the fire, steam curling from the teapot between them. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "you told me once that Mrs. Pritchard had a visitor before she vanished. A man with a soldier's walk. Did she ever say where he'd served?" Molly frowned, thinking. "I'm not sure. She said he knew the colonel from the regiment, yes, but she didn't mention which one. Did he leave anything behind? A glove, a hat, a button, perhaps?" Molly looked startled. "A button?" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "I found one in the church. He'd belonged to that regiment, the Royal Gloucestershire Light Infantry." Molly's hand went to her mouth. "That's it. The colonel served there years ago. I remember Mrs. Pritchard saying something about an old scandal. Something that was hushed up. She said she'd found proof in his papers, something to do with a man who'd taken money meant for the regiment's widows. But she wouldn't tell me who. Did she send those papers anywhere?" "No, she was going to see Mr. Denning about them. But she changed her mind. She said she didn't trust him anymore." "Wise of her," Miss Marple murmured. "Men who are nervous of secrets usually have one of their own." Just then there came a knock at the door. Craddock entered, hat in hand. "Evening, Miss Marple. Sorry to intrude, but we've had a development. Basil Pritchard's packed a bag and gone missing." Molly gasped. "Gone? But where?" "No one knows," Craddock said. "He told the innkeeper he was going to London. But there's been no train ticket, no sight of him at the station. And there's something else. A set of fingerprints found on the lockbox from Mrs. Pritchard's study. They're not Basil's or hers." Miss Marple set her teacup down carefully. "Then they belong to the man from the regiment," she said quietly. "And I dare say, Inspector, we shall find he is not so very far from St. Mary Mead as he'd like us to think." Outside the wind had risen again, rattling the panes. The village lights shimmered faintly through the mist. Miss Marple watched the flickering glow and spoke almost to herself. "People believe the dead are silent, but they are not. They speak through what they leave behind, buttons, papers, a smudge of clay. It's only a matter of listening carefully enough to hear them." Craddock studied her a moment, then nodded. "Then perhaps, Miss Marple, it's time we started listening properly." She smiled, her eyes bright. "Oh, I already am, Inspector. I always have been." Inspector Craddock arrived early the next morning, his coat still damp from the drizzle outside. His expression set in that grim determination Miss Marple had come to recognize as the look of a man chasing a truth he didn't yet want to find. She had been expecting him, of course. There was already tea on the tray and a fresh fire burning in the hearth when she let him in. "Good morning, Inspector," she said mildly, motioning toward the armchair. "I was just thinking of you. There's nothing quite so invigorating as a puzzle in need of finishing. Don't you agree?" Craddock managed a tired smile. "You seem to find them invigorating, Miss Marple. I find them exhausting. Basil Pritchard still hasn't turned up, and Denning's been caught in a lie. He said he hadn't been near Mrs. Pritchard's house for a week, but a witness saw him there the day before the disappearance. Did they now?" she said softly. "I imagine he had a very good reason for forgetting that particular visit." Craddock sighed. "He claims it was for business. Says she called him about her will. But the more I dig, the more it looks like there's something else tying these people together. The colonel, Denning, the regiment, it all feels connected." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. "Connections are curious things, Inspector. They're often invisible until one looks from just the right angle. Tell me, did your men find any trace of that missing box from Mrs. Pritchard's study?" He shook his head. "Not yet. We've searched her cottage top to bottom. Nothing. But there's one thing that keeps troubling me. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small object wrapped in paper. We found this near the quarry, caught in a hedge about 50 yards from the path. Recognize it? She unwrapped it gently. It was another brass button, identical to the one she'd found at the church. She turned it over and smiled faintly. Our soldier has been rather careless, hasn't he? Craddock frowned. Which means he was near the quarry. That's where you found the red clay too, wasn't it? Indeed, she said. A place of quiet isolation, perfect for concealment. But our murderer didn't leave her there. He brought her to the pond instead, closer to home, more familiar. A sentimental gesture, perhaps, or an attempt to mislead. Craddock leaned forward. You're certain it's the same man? The one Mrs. Pritchard met before she disappeared? Quite certain. And I believe she recognized him too, though not immediately. A man from her husband's regiment, perhaps disgraced or dismissed. She found proof of his misdeeds in those papers, I suspect, and meant to expose him. But the past has long arms, Inspector. Longer than most people realize. He nodded slowly. We've sent word to the War Office to look into any surviving officers from that regiment. If this fellow's alive, we'll find him. Miss Marple smiled gently. I've no doubt you will, though I rather think he's already here. Craddock looked startled. Here in the village? Oh, not openly, she said, her voice mild. But he's near enough to keep watch. People who've done wicked things rarely wander far from their handiwork. They like to make sure it stays tidy. He stared at her for a moment, uncertain whether she spoke in jest or conviction. Then, with a slow nod, he stood. I'll have my men keep a sharper lookout. And Miss Marple, thank you. You always see the things the rest of us overlook. When he'd gone, Miss Marple remained by the fire, her mind turning over each piece of the puzzle. There was something she couldn't quite shake, something about Tom Redding. His defensiveness, his insistence that Basil was innocent. It wasn't guilt she'd seen in his face, not exactly, but fear. Fear for someone else, and that, she thought, was more revealing than guilt itself. That afternoon she walked into the village, stopping at the churchyard. The choir had gathered again, though practice had been cancelled. They stood in small clusters, speaking in low voices. Miss Marple approached Molly, who looked pale and drawn. Are you bearing up, my dear? She asked kindly. Molly nodded weakly. It's strange, Miss Marple. Everyone stares as if I've done something terrible. I keep thinking, if I'd walked home with her that night, maybe she'd still be alive. Miss Marple touched her arm gently. No good ever comes of thinking that way. The living must not take on the blame of the dead. Tell me, has Tom been to see you? Molly hesitated. Yes, last night. He said he was leaving for a few days, some work up near Reading. But I think he just wanted to get away from all the talk. Did he say when he'd return? No, only that he'd write. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And he left straight after? Yes, why? Oh, no reason, Miss Marple said softly. Only it's an odd time for anyone to travel with the weather so poor. As she left the churchyard, she noticed Reverend Clement speaking to a stranger by the gate, a man in a dark coat, hat pulled low. He had the bearing of someone accustomed to command. When he turned briefly toward her, she caught a glimpse of a face lined and severe with sharp blue eyes. It was not a face one forgot easily. That evening she received a visit from the vicar himself. He seemed troubled. Jane, he said, I meant to mention, a man came asking about Colonel Pritchard. Said his name was Captain Reed. Claimed he'd served under the colonel years ago, Captain Reed. She repeated thoughtfully. And did he say why he was here? He said he'd heard of Mrs. Pritchard's death and wanted to pay his respects. But there was something about him. He asked a great many questions. About the police, about Basil, about you even. About me, she said, amused. How flattering. Did you tell him I was fond of gardening and never could resist a mystery? The vicar smiled faintly, though his worry lingered. He seemed particularly interested in whether the police had found any of the colonel's papers. Ah, she said. Then I think we've just met our soldier. Reverend Clement's eyes widened. "You mean—" "I mean," Miss Marple said gently, "that Mrs. Pritchard's visitor has returned to see whether his secret still lies buried. But I dare say he'll find St. Mary Mead a rather more observant place than he expects." That night, the wind rose again, rattling the windows and sending loose branches tapping against the panes. Miss Marple sat up later than usual, knitting forgotten in her lap, her thoughts sharp and restless. She recalled the expression on Captain Reed's face, controlled but watchful. The kind of man who never truly relaxed, even in conversation. A man accustomed to lying as easily as breathing. Just after 10, a soft knock came at her door. She opened it to find Molly standing there, trembling, her cloak soaked through. "Miss Marple, I'm sorry, it's Tom. He's not gone to Reading. He's here. I saw him by the green just now, talking to that man, the one who said he was a captain." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Did they see you?" "I don't think so. But I heard something. Captain Reed said, 'It's too late to back out now.' And Tom said, 'I never wanted this. Not like this.'" Then they walked off toward the old rectory lane. Miss Marple took her shawl and hat at once. "Go home, Molly, and lock your door. Say nothing to anyone. But, Miss Marple, please, my dear, do as I say." Within moments she was out in the mist, the lane dimly lit by the moon's uncertain glow. The air was cold and still, carrying the faint sound of voices ahead. She moved quietly, keeping to the hedgerows. When she reached the bend near the rectory, she stopped. Two figures stood by the gate, Reed's tall silhouette and Tom's slighter one. Reed's hand was on Tom's arm, firm, almost threatening. "Don't be a fool," Reed's voice carried low and hard. "You've done your part. Keep quiet and you'll be safe." Tom's reply was shaky. "You said no one would be hurt." Reed laughed softly, the sound sharp as glass. "The dead don't talk, lad. Remember that." Then suddenly Reed turned, his gaze scanning the darkness. For a moment, Miss Marple thought he'd seen her, but before he could move, another beam of light broke across the lane. The flash of a police lantern. Inspector Craddock's voice rang out, firm and clear. "Captain Reed." "Stay where you are." Reed froze. Tom stepped back, pale and shaking. And from behind the hedgerow, Miss Marple watched silently, her heart steady. The trap she'd set had sprung at last, and though she took no pleasure in triumph, she felt the quiet certainty that truth, once awakened, could never again be silenced. The light from Inspector Craddock's lantern cut through the mist, striking the cold gleam of the revolver in Captain Reed's hand. For a tense instant the lane held its breath. Tom Redding froze, his eyes wide with panic. The inspector stepped forward, one hand raised in warning, the other steady on his holster. "Put it down, Reed," Craddock ordered. "There's nowhere to run and too many witnesses to silence." Reed's expression didn't change. It was composed, almost bored. "You've no idea what you're interfering with, Inspector. This is a matter of honor, old business long buried." Miss Marple, still concealed in the hedgerow, observed silently. She saw the faint tremor in Reed's wrist, the quick glance toward the quarry path, his only possible escape route. "Honor," she murmured softly to herself, "is such a dangerous word in the mouths of frightened men." Tom made a sudden move, stepping between Reed and Craddock. "Don't shoot him," he cried. "He didn't mean to. He didn't mean for it to happen." Craddock's voice was firm. "Step aside, lad. He'll do you no favors by the time he's finished saving himself." Reed's jaw tightened. "You think you know what happened?" he said, his voice low. "You think that old woman's death was murder?" He gave a harsh laugh. "It was an accident. She slipped, fell, nothing more. But she found something she shouldn't have. That was her mistake." Miss Marple took a quiet step forward, her voice calm but carrying in the damp air. "And yours, Captain, was thinking that one lie could bury another. But the past has a habit of unearthing itself, like the red clay at the quarry." Reed turned sharply, startled by her voice, and in that moment Craddock lunged, knocking the gun from his hand. It clattered against the stones, and the inspector's men closed in. Reed struggled briefly before realizing resistance was futile. He stood panting, his once impeccable composure crumbling. "Take him," Craddock said curtly. 2 constables led the captain away, his boots scraping against the gravel. Tom Redding sank to his knees, face pale as chalk. Miss Marple approached quietly, laying a hand on the young man's shoulder. "You've done the right thing, Tom," she said gently. "The truth was going to come out one way or another." He looked up at her, his voice breaking. "I never meant for her to die, Miss Marple. I swear it. He said we were only to frighten her, to get the papers back. I didn't know he hit her and she fell. He told me she was still breathing when we left." Craddock crouched beside him, his tone stern but not unkind. "Start from the beginning, lad. What did Reed tell you?" Tom's words came in halting bursts. "He came to me weeks ago, said he'd known Colonel Pritchard in the regiment, that the colonel had kept something he shouldn't, letters, documents that could ruin men even now. He said Mrs. Pritchard had found them and was threatening to make them public. He wanted them back. I didn't know what they were about. He said it was military business, best left alone. When I hesitated, he told me Molly would be in danger if I didn't help." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "So he used your heart against your judgment. A cruel tactic, but an effective one." Tom nodded miserably. "He told me to meet him after choir practice near the church. He waited outside while I went to her cottage. I asked her to give me the papers, told her Reed would explain everything in the morning. But she wouldn't listen. She said she'd already arranged to see the police about it. Then he came in, out of nowhere, and there was shouting. She tried to run. He grabbed her arm, she fell, her head hit the edge of the hearth. The boy's voice cracked and he buried his face in his hands. He said she was dead. He said we had to move her. We put her in her car, drove her to the pond. So I didn't even realize until later that he'd taken the papers. He said it had to look like she'd run off or drowned by accident. I wanted to go to the police, but he said they'd hang me too." Craddock's jaw clenched. "And you believed him?" Tom nodded weakly. "I was a fool." Miss Marple's tone was gentle but steady. "No, Tom. You were simply frightened, and fear clouds the mind faster than guilt ever can." The inspector stood, signaling his men to take Reed away to Much Benham. Then he turned to Miss Marple, his expression a mixture of gratitude and exasperation. "You might have mentioned you suspected him sooner, you know." She smiled faintly. "Oh, but you'd never have caught him without the boy's confession. Reed's type rarely breaks under pressure. They only falter when they think they've outsmarted everyone else. He couldn't resist coming back to watch his work." Craddock shook his head. "You have a remarkable instinct for these things, Miss Marple. I'll never quite understand how you saw it so clearly." "It's only observation, Inspector," she said lightly. "Men like Captain Reed always believe they can control their stories. But I've learned that lies, like knitting yarn, have a way of tangling when pulled too tightly. And in the end, one sees the pattern. The following day, St. Mary Mead woke to the news of the arrest. The story spread through the village like wildfire, retold with flourishes that grew more extravagant by the hour. By noon, Mrs. Price Ridley was telling anyone who would listen that she'd always suspected the stranger who'd come asking after the colonel, while Miss Hartnell claimed she'd noticed Tom Redding acting queer for weeks. The Blue Boar's bar filled with speculation about what would happen next, and though everyone pretended to be shocked, there was a distinct thrill in the air, a sense that their quiet lives had brushed against something grand and terrible. Miss Marple went about her morning errands quietly, offering no comment. She stopped at the post office to collect a letter, exchanged pleasantries with the grocer, and was nearly home when Molly appeared, hurrying toward her. The girl looked exhausted, her eyes swollen from crying. "They say they're taking Tom to London," Molly said, clutching her shawl. "They say he's to be tried as an accomplice, but he didn't mean to hurt her, Miss Marple. He's good. He just lost his head." Miss Marple sighed softly. "I believe you, my dear. And I think Inspector Craddock does too. But the law requires truth to be weighed carefully, not kindly." Molly swallowed hard. "If only I'd stopped him from going that night. If only I'd known what Reed was really after. Regret is a heavy garment, child," Miss Marple said gently. It will drag you under if you let it. What's done is done. The best we can do is see the truth told properly. That evening the vicar called on her again, bringing news that Reed had confessed. He had once been an officer under Colonel Pritchard, dismissed for embezzling regimental funds. The colonel had kept the proof, intending to hand it over to the authorities. When he died, the papers vanished, until his widow found them among his belongings. Reed, ruined by the thought of exposure, had followed her to St. Mary Mead to retrieve them. "It's remarkable," said the Reverend, shaking his head. "All this tragedy over something that happened years ago." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly, stirring her tea. "But people don't measure guilt in years, Reverend. They measure it in sleepless nights, and some debts, no matter how old, refuse to stay forgotten." The vicar smiled sadly. "And so justice is done again, thanks to you." Miss Marple shook her head. "Justice, perhaps. But peace, no, that will take longer. Poor Molly must carry this sorrow for years. And poor Tom, for all his foolishness, will learn that remorse is its own kind of punishment." She rose, crossing to the window. The rain had stopped, and the moon shone faintly over the green where Mrs. Pritchard's car still stood, soon to be taken away. The village looked peaceful again, its secrets momentarily silenced. After the vicar left, Miss Marple settled by the fire with her knitting. Her needles moved with quiet precision, the steady rhythm soothing after days of tension. Yet her thoughts lingered on the frailties she'd seen: pride, fear, greed, love. They were, she reflected, the same old threads that had entangled humanity since time began. And as the clock struck 9, she smiled faintly to herself. "There's nothing so deceptive as an English village," she murmured. "All those neat gardens and polite smiles, and beneath them the whole of human nature just waiting to be noticed." Outside, the wind stirred the hedges, carrying with it the faint echo of a church bell. The case of the vanished widow was over, but in Miss Marple's quiet heart the pattern of it would remain, another small reminder that evil, however cleverly concealed, was never quite clever enough. The following morning arrived with a thin veil of sunlight creeping across the thatched roofs of St. Mary Mead, timid and cold after nights of rain. The village, still abuzz with the excitement of the previous evening's arrest, had settled into a wary quiet. The newspapers hadn't yet printed the full story. Only whispers passed between the cottages, stitched together by imagination and gossip. Miss Marple knew how swiftly such stories multiplied. Truth was always the quietest voice in a room full of conjecture. She had slept little, her thoughts turning over the matter of Tom Redding's confession. Something in it troubled her. The facts aligned well enough. Reed's motive was plain and his guilt undeniable. But Miss Marple's instincts, fine-tuned by years of watching human nature unfold, told her the story was not quite finished. There was a subtle misalignment, like a tune half a note off key. She sat that morning by her window, knitting in slow, deliberate rhythm, her eyes occasionally lifting to the lane outside. The post arrived just before 9, carried by young Ted Larkin, who wore an expression halfway between curiosity and fear. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, handing her 2 envelopes. "You've heard about that captain, haven't you? They say he's to be taken to London today. Fancy that! Murder in our own village." "Terrible business, Ted," she replied mildly. "I do hope your mother remembered to cover her dahlias. I fear there may be frost tonight." The boy looked momentarily deflated by her calm, as though murder and flowers ought not to occupy the same conversation. He nodded and hurried away, no doubt to share whatever new theory he'd invented before breakfast. Miss Marple smiled faintly, then turned to her letters. One was from an old friend in Chedcombe, full of cheerful inconsequence. The other bore no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. She opened it and read, "You think it's over. It isn't. There's more buried than you know. Ask about the will. Ask Denning before they silence him too." The handwriting was rough, uneven, and blotted in places, as though written in haste, or by a trembling hand. Miss Marple read it twice, her expression unchanging. Then she slipped it back into the envelope and set it beside her teacup. By mid-morning, Inspector Craddock arrived again, looking graver than before. "We've got Reed on his way to Much Benham now," he said. "He said his piece, though most of it's self-serving drivel. Claims the death was accidental. We'll let the jury decide that." "Quite," Miss Marple said, pouring him tea. "But tell me, Inspector, have you spoken to Mr. Denning since last night?" Craddock frowned. "The solicitor's clerk—" "No, not yet. He's been confined to bed, nerves apparently. I was going to see him this afternoon." "Why do you ask?" She handed him the anonymous note. He read it, his brow darkening. "Another meddler," he said irritably. "Probably someone trying to stir things up again." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "But the mention of the will is interesting, don't you think? Mrs. Pritchard had changed it only days before her death. That could complicate matters." He looked at her keenly. "You think Denning knows something?" "Oh, I rather think he knows quite a lot. Men in his profession always do. The question is whether he's been frightened into forgetting it," Craddock sighed. "Very well. I'll see him straight away." Miss Marple watched him leave, then fetched her shawl and hat. She had no intention of remaining idle when questions were waiting to be asked. Denning lived above the solicitor's office, a narrow building near the green. The curtains were drawn when she arrived, but at her knock a muffled voice called out, "Come in." She entered to find him sitting by the fire, pale and jittery, his hands clasped tightly. "Miss Marple," he said weakly, "I was just about to send for the doctor. I've barely slept since all this began." "Stress affects the nerves, Mr. Denning," she said kindly, taking a seat. "But truth, I've found, affects them even more." He swallowed hard. "You've heard about the confession? Then it's all over, surely." "Perhaps. But I wonder, what part did you play in it?" He looked genuinely shocked. "Me? None! I only handled some papers for Mrs. Pritchard. Routine matters." "Routine?" she echoed softly. "I understand she changed her will not long before her death." "That hardly seems routine." Denning's hands twitched. Yes, she did. She wanted to leave the bulk of her estate to charity. Said she'd had enough of her husband's relations. Called them vultures, if I remember correctly. And did Basil Pritchard know of this change? Well, she told me she hadn't informed him yet. She meant to, but... He trailed off, staring into the fire. "But what, Mr. Denning?" He hesitated. "She said something odd, just before she left my office that last day. She said, 'I've done the right thing at last. But if anything happens to me, you'll know why.' I didn't understand at the time. I thought she was being dramatic." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "And the papers, those that went missing from her study." He hesitated again. "I shouldn't say solicitor's privilege and all that, but yes, I saw them. She brought them to me. They were letters between the colonel and several other officers, Captain Reed among them. Proof of the embezzlement. She said she meant to hand them over to the War Office." "And you still have them?" He shook his head miserably. "No, she insisted on taking them back that evening. Said she'd locked them in her study." Miss Marple sat back, her knitting bag at her feet. "Then whoever killed her knew exactly what he wanted, and where to find it. But the note I received this morning suggests someone else may know more. Someone who believes you're in danger." Denning went white. "Danger? From whom?" Before she could answer, a knock sounded at the door. Craddock entered, his face grim. "Denning," he said, "I'm afraid you'll need to come with me. We found Basil Pritchard's suitcase at the old quarry, burnt papers inside. Looks like he's been trying to destroy evidence." Denning stood abruptly, his face contorted in panic. "Basil, he's here." "I thought he'd gone to London." "So did we," Craddock said. "But the station master says no ticket was bought under his name. He's been hiding nearby, likely hoping Reed's arrest would keep the attention off him." Miss Marple rose, her expression calm but her eyes thoughtful. "I rather think Mr. Basil's role in this is not quite secondary. Captain Reed may have killed Mrs. Pritchard, yes, but perhaps not entirely for his own sake." Craddock looked at her sharply. "You think Basil was involved?" "I think," she said, "that greed makes very strange partnerships. Reed had a secret worth killing for. Basil had a fortune worth inheriting. And Mrs. Pritchard, well, she stood in the way of both." Even as she spoke, a constable burst through the door, breathless. "Inspector! They've found him! Down by the mill road, trying to get through the woods." Within minutes, Craddock and his men were gone. Miss Marple lingered a moment, then turned to Denning, who looked as though the room were spinning. "Courage, Mr. Denning," she said gently. "The truth is like a wound. It hurts most just before it heals." As she stepped outside, the wind carried the sound of shouting from the direction of the woods. She walked slowly toward the green, her thoughts steady. She could already sense how the pattern fit together, the motive shared, the greed disguised as desperation, the final betrayal waiting to be revealed. By the time she reached her cottage, the church bell was tolling faintly in the distance, and as she closed her garden gate, Miss Marple knew that before the day was out, St. Mary Mead would see one more confession, and this one, she suspected, would be the most revealing of all. The air was sharp with the scent of rain and earth, as Miss Marple stepped out into the lane once more. The commotion had drawn most of the village toward the mill road, where shouts echoed faintly through the trees. She walked briskly but without haste. Years of experience had taught her that truth, unlike youth, could not be chased. It revealed itself only when approached with patience. The closer she came to the edge of the wood, the clearer the noise grew. Men calling to one another, the rustle of boots through undergrowth, and the faint, desperate crash of someone forcing his way through brambles. By the time she reached the bend, the scene was already unfolding. Inspector Craddock stood near the gate of the old mill, his overcoat drenched, his expression grim. Two constables had Basil Pritchard pinned between them, his once dapper appearance reduced to dishevelment, mud streaking his coat, collar torn, his eyes wild with exhaustion. "You can't prove anything," he was shouting, though his voice had the brittle edge of panic. "I didn't touch her, he did. Reed killed her, not me." Craddock's voice was hard, deliberate. "And you helped him hide the body. You think that makes you innocent?" "I didn't know she was dead," Basil cried, struggling against the constable's grip. "He told me it was all taken care of, that she'd gone away. I only helped him burn the papers. It was his idea, his plan." Miss Marple, watching from the roadside, noted the words carefully. Men in terror often told more truth than they intended. Craddock turned and saw her, surprise flickering briefly across his face. "Miss Marple," he said, stepping toward her, "you've an unfortunate talent for appearing just when the story reaches its most unpleasant chapter." She smiled faintly. "I find, Inspector, that unpleasant chapters tend to close themselves sooner when one reads them to the end." He motioned for her to stand back, as Basil was led toward the waiting motor car. "We'll question him at Much Benham," he said. "But if you ask me, the man's a coward, not a killer. He's trying to save his own skin by shifting the blame." "Cowards," Miss Marple said softly, "often serve killers better than friends do. They make perfect accomplices, pliable, frightened, and easily discarded when their usefulness ends." Craddock gave her a tired nod. "I'll send word once we've had his statement." The village seemed to exhale as the car drove off, taking Basil with it. The onlookers dispersed slowly, their murmurs rippling through the damp air. Miss Marple lingered a little while longer near the mill gate. There was something about the place, something that tugged faintly at her memory. The stream beside it ran fast and brown with rain, and the moss-covered wheel turned lazily in the current. A single padlock hung from the shed door nearby, its surface rusted but recently disturbed. Her eyes lingered on it. Then on the ground beneath, faint impressions in the mud. Too small to belong to Basil or the constables. Someone else had been there recently. She bent slightly, studying the marks. "A woman's shoes," she murmured. "And not old ones." The thought troubled her. Who would come here, to a place now tainted by scandal and danger? She straightened slowly. the chill air seeping into her bones. As she turned to leave, she saw movement at the far edge of the wood, a shadow slipping away toward the path that led back to the village. Small, quick, and unmistakably feminine, that night the village settled under uneasy quiet. Lamps glowed dimly through curtained windows, and the rain began again, steady and persistent. Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting forgotten in her lap. The image of those small footprints haunted her. Only one woman in St. Mary Mead, she thought, would have reason enough to return to that place. Molly Lane. She waited until morning before acting. The following day was pale and cold, a thin frost glistening on the hedgerows. Molly's cottage sat at the far end of the lane, its curtains drawn. When Miss Marple knocked, there was no immediate answer. She waited a moment, then knocked again. Finally the door opened a fraction, and Molly appeared, pale, dishevelled, eyes red-rimmed. "Oh, Miss Marple," she whispered, "I can't talk to anyone right now. Please, My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "I only came to return something you left behind." Molly blinked in confusion. "Left behind?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, producing a small handkerchief embroidered with the letter M. "I believe it was yours. I found it near the old mill." The girl froze, the colour draining from her face. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Molly's lips parted. You've been there?" "Only briefly. It's a lonely place for walking, especially at night." Molly sank onto a chair, trembling. "I didn't mean to go back. Something told me I had to see it again. I thought maybe Tom is safe, my dear," Miss Marple said. "He told the truth, and that will help him. But there's something else you're keeping back, isn't there?" Molly's hands twisted in her lap. "I can't," she said hoarsely. "If I tell you, it will ruin everything." Miss Marple's tone softened. "You cannot ruin what's already been spoiled, child. But you may still mend a little of it. Tell me what you saw that night." The girl's shoulders shook. "I went to the church to fetch my gloves. Mrs. Pritchard had already gone. I saw Tom outside with a man, Reed. They didn't see me. I heard them arguing. Reed said something about money and papers. Tom looked frightened. I was going to go to them, but then I saw Mrs. Pritchard's car by the green and someone else getting into it. A man in a dark coat, but not Reed. He drove away fast." Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. "Not Reed?" "No, he was still there, shouting at Tom. The man in the car was taller, broader. I thought it was Basil, but I wasn't sure." It was dark. Miss Marple sat back, her eyes distant. "So Basil may have been there all along," she murmured. "Perhaps not as ignorant of events as he'd like us to believe." Molly nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "When they found Mrs. Pritchard's body, I thought it must have been Reed. But then I saw Basil yesterday, near the mill. He was digging at something by the stream. I was too afraid to tell anyone." Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "You did the right thing in telling me now. Sometimes the truth needs coaxing out slowly like a frightened bird. But I think I know what he was looking for." She rose, her face thoughtful. "Stay here, my dear, and rest. I'll send word to Inspector Craddock. I expect he'll want to see that spot by the stream again." By afternoon, Craddock and 2 constables had returned to the mill with spades and lanterns. Miss Marple stood nearby, hands clasped, watching the men work. It didn't take long. Beneath a layer of damp earth near the shed, they unearthed a small metal box, charred but intact. Craddock pried it open carefully. Inside were the remains of letters, a signet ring, and several folded documents. One sheet, though water-damaged, still bore the seal of the late Colonel Pritchard. Craddock let out a low whistle. So that's what Reed was after. Proof of the embezzlement, and perhaps Basil's hand in it too. Miss Marple's eyes were calm. "Indeed. But there's more than one kind of proof, Inspector. Those letters may tell you about stolen money, but the way they were hidden tells you something else entirely." He looked at her curiously. "What's that?" "That Mrs. Pritchard knew her killer far better than we thought. She hid those papers not to expose him, but to protect someone else, someone she cared for, perhaps too much." Craddock frowned. You mean Basil? No, Miss Marple said quietly. I mean Tom. She must have discovered Reed's connection to him. Perhaps that Reed had threatened or ensnared the boy, so she tried to bargain to shield him. But she underestimated how far Reed would go. And Basil, when he learned what was at stake, saw an opportunity to secure both silence and inheritance. Craddock shook his head slowly. You make it sound simple. Evil, Miss Marple said softly, is rarely complicated. It's merely selfishness, stripped of its manners. As the constables sealed the box for evidence, the first flakes of snow began to drift from the sky, soft and silent. Miss Marple stood watching them fall, her breath misting in the chill air. The case, she knew, was nearly over, but as she turned toward home, she couldn't shake the image of that frightened girl and the boy who had lost his way. There would be no tidy endings here, only the quiet, lingering ache that followed whenever human frailty met its reckoning. Still, she thought, as the snow settled gently over the green, it was better this way. Better that truth, however painful, should lie above the ground than buried beneath it. The snow continued to fall through the evening, softening the sharp outlines of the village and cloaking St. Mary Mead in a deceptive peace. Beneath that quiet, however, tension hummed like a hidden wire. Everyone now knew that Basil Pritchard had been caught near the mill, that letters had been found, that something dark had been unearthed, though, as always, the details were muddled by gossip. The Blue Boar was alive with speculation. Mrs. Price Ridley insisted the Colonel had been a spy, while Miss Hartnell preferred the more romantic notion that Mrs. Pritchard had died protecting an illicit love affair. Only Miss Marple, sitting by her fire with her shawl drawn close, kept her thoughts entirely to herself. The following morning dawned bright and brittle. Sunlight glinted off frozen hedges, and the village seemed for the first time in days to breathe again. But Miss Marple's rest was brief. A knock came just after 9, and when she opened her door, Inspector Craddock stood there, hat in hand, his expression weary yet intent. "We've got Basil talking," he said. "Or trying to, at least. He's evasive as ever, but it's clear now that Reed wasn't acting entirely on his own. There was some arrangement between them. Money, threats, something of the sort. We found letters between the two in that box, dated from before Mrs. Pritchard's death." "Then you have the proof you need," Miss Marple said mildly, motioning him to come in. "Perhaps, but it still doesn't explain why Basil went back to the mill," Craddock said. "He could have fled, but instead he tried to recover what was already lost. I can't decide whether he's foolish or desperate." "Both, I suspect," Miss Marple said, pouring tea. "And desperation in men like Basil often leads to foolishness. What of the letters themselves? Did you read them?" Craddock nodded. Reed was blackmailing him. Apparently the Colonel discovered that Basil had been using family funds, regimental investments, to settle his own debts years ago. Reed found out and used it against him. After the Colonel's death, Mrs. Pritchard came across the papers and intended to make the matter public. That's when Basil wrote to Reed, asking him to intervene before she could ruin them both. Miss Marple stirred her tea gently, the spoon clinking softly against the china. "So he did not simply benefit from Reed's crime, he invited it." "Exactly," Craddock said grimly, "though he claims he never expected Reed to kill her. Says it was only meant to be a warning." "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "Warnings have a dreadful habit of turning into tragedies when left in the hands of violent men." Craddock sighed. "He'll hang, of course. Or perhaps not. Perhaps they'll call it manslaughter. But it's a miserable business. I can't help feeling sorry for the woman. She tried to do what was right, and it cost her everything." Miss Marple looked into the fire for a long moment before replying. "It often does, Inspector. The good are seldom rewarded in tidy ways." He stood after finishing his tea. "We'll be taking Basil to London this evening. I'll call for your statement before I go, though truth be told you've already solved more than my entire department managed." She smiled faintly. "Oh, I doubt that, Inspector. I merely listened while others talked." He chuckled softly. "If everyone listened as you do, Miss Marple, there'd be no work left for the police." When he'd gone, she sat quietly for some time, her knitting untouched. Outside, the snow had begun to thaw, turning to soft rivulets that trickled along the lane. She could hear the church bell in the distance, solemn and steady. It should have felt like an ending, but it didn't. There was still something unsettled in her mind, a final note that refused to resolve. Late that afternoon, as she was preparing to take a short walk before dusk, a knock came again. This time it was Molly. The girl's face was pale and drawn, but there was a flicker of determination in her eyes. "Miss Marple," she said breathlessly, "I had to see you before the inspector leaves. There's something I've remembered, something about that night." Miss Marple gestured for her to sit. "Take your time, my dear. Tell me what's troubling you." Molly clasped her hands tightly in her lap. "It's about the letters, the ones Mrs. Pritchard showed me the week before she died. I didn't mention it before because I was afraid it didn't matter. But there was one letter she didn't show Mr. Denning or anyone else. She said it was private. It was from her husband to her. He wrote that he'd forgiven someone for a debt. She tore it up after reading it. But she said something strange. I wonder if forgiveness is always a kindness." Miss Marple's eyes brightened faintly. "Forgiveness," she murmured. "How human of her, and how fatal." Molly looked confused. "Do you think it means something?" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "I think it means everything." Within the hour she had sent a message to Craddock, asking him to meet her once more before his departure. When he arrived, she greeted him with her usual composure, though her eyes were alight with purpose. "Inspector," she said, "I believe there's one more piece to this puzzle. Mrs. Pritchard's murder was planned, yes, but its timing, its suddenness, was not Reed's alone." Basil needed her silenced quickly, because she was about to do something that would destroy him completely. Craddock frowned. "You mean she'd found those letters?" "Not just found them. She was going to hand them over," Miss Marple said. But Basil's panic came when she mentioned rewriting her will. "You recall she changed it recently, leaving most of her estate to charity." "Yes, but what she didn't tell anyone," Miss Marple continued, "was that she'd written a codicil, a small amendment, after speaking with her solicitor. It reinstated Basil as beneficiary, on one condition, that he repay the stolen funds to the regiment's account. She was testing his conscience. If he complied, he would inherit. If he refused, the codicil would be destroyed." That letter she tore up. The Colonel's words of forgiveness must have inspired her to try one of her own. Craddock's brows furrowed. But Basil couldn't have known that. "Oh, but he did," Miss Marple said. She told him. Not out of cruelty, but hope. She believed he might change if given the chance. And when he realized what it meant, that she still held the evidence and could undo him with a single word, he reached out to Reed, thinking to frighten her into silence. Only Reed had his own stake in the matter, and fear turned to greed. Thus the two devils struck their bargain. Craddock exhaled slowly. "Then she was killed for her forgiveness." "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. The cruelest irony of all. Her kindness was mistaken for weakness, and both men in their arrogance thought they could profit from it. He stood, gazing down at her with something like admiration. "You make it sound almost inevitable." "Human nature usually is," she replied, "but inevitability doesn't excuse it." By the next morning the news had spread through St. Mary Mead that the case was over. Reed and Basil Pritchard would face trial together. Tom Redding, though still deeply shaken, was to be spared prosecution, his part in the affair judged coerced. The village, ever hungry for closure, began its slow return to normality. Choir practice resumed, the Blue Boar's gossip softened into repetition, and the memory of the murder began to fade like a stain scrubbed too many times. Miss Marple, however, remained thoughtful. When Reverend Clement visited her that evening, bringing flowers and gentle thanks, she accepted them with a faint smile. It was a dreadful business, he said, shaking his head. One almost feels guilty for being grateful it's finished. Ah, she said, arranging the flowers, but these things never quite finish, Reverend. The past is like ivy. It grows quietly back over what one believes cleared. He regarded her curiously. You think there will be more to it? Oh no, she said with a serene smile. Only that people forget the lessons such tragedies teach. They rush back to their comforts, to their gossip, to their small quarrels, and so the same roots sprout anew elsewhere. It's the nature of villages, and of mankind. He looked at her for a moment, then nodded slowly. You're probably right. Still, the village owes you more than it will ever know. When he left, Miss Marple sat again by her fire, her needles moving softly in the hush of evening. Outside, the snow melted into rivulets that glittered beneath the street lamps, and a faint breeze carried the scent of damp earth and renewal. Somewhere beyond, she could hear the choir practicing once more, their voices faint but pure. She smiled to herself, the gentlest of expressions, touched with melancholy. Another tragedy closed, another truth uncovered. The world, she thought, was endlessly imperfect, but endlessly fascinating too. And perhaps that was what kept her so very patient with it. She set her knitting aside and rose to draw the curtains. Across the lane, the light in Molly Lane's cottage glowed softly, a fragile promise that youth, though bruised, might yet heal. Miss Marple lingered at the window a moment longer, then turned back to the fire. Yes, she murmured to the empty room, forgiveness can be dangerous, but it's still the only thing that ever mends what wickedness breaks. The clock struck 10. Outside, the village of St. Mary Mead lay still once more, its gardens neat, its secrets buried, and its peace restored, at least for now. The trial came and went with the grim efficiency of English justice. Captain Reed was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. Basil Pritchard, though spared the rope, received a lengthy prison term for his part in the conspiracy. The newspapers devoted columns to the scandal. Murder in a country choir, one headline read, but to St. Mary Mead it was all rather too close to home to be spoken of for long. Villagers preferred to let the matter fade into whispers and half-remembered anecdotes, polishing their versions until even they began to believe them. Within a month, life had begun its quiet return to rhythm. The choir resumed its practices, the Blue Boar its gossip, and the vicar his sermons on human frailty. Only Miss Marple, ever thoughtful, noticed the subtle ways in which the village had changed. Mrs. Hartnell was less quick to scold. Molly Lane walked with an older, steadier kind of sadness, and even the postmistress, Miss Webb, spoke with a touch more gentleness when recounting local mischief. Evil, Miss Marple often said, left behind a scent that never entirely washed away. It lingered in the corners of conscience, reminding everyone of what people were capable of when fear and greed took root. One bright afternoon, as spring began to stir, Molly came to visit. She looked stronger now, the pale uncertainty of grief replaced by quiet resolve. "They've sent word," she said softly. "Tom's been released. He's to go work for a cousin near Bath. I wanted to thank you, Miss Marple." "You saved his life." Miss Marple smiled, setting aside her embroidery. "No, my dear, I merely helped truth find its way out. It has a dreadful tendency to hide in the most inconvenient places." Molly hesitated, then said, "He asked me to tell you something. He said you were right, that Mrs. Pritchard was trying to protect him, not expose anyone. He said she'd forgiven him before she died. He'll never forget that." A faint warmth touched Miss Marple's eyes. Few people do forget forgiveness. It's a heavier burden than guilt in the end, but a kinder one. They had tea together by the fire, and when Molly left, the afternoon light was already dipping gold across the garden. Miss Marple sat a while longer, reflecting on how swiftly life resumed its deceptive gentleness after horror had passed. The sparrows were noisy in the hedgerow, the kettle whistled cheerfully on the hob, and yet somewhere in those ordinary sounds was a kind of fragile defiance. life's quiet insistence on continuing. That evening, the vicar dropped by, his cheeks pink from the cold. He brought with him a copy of the Times, in which a small notice announced Captain Reed's execution. "A dreadful business, Jane," he said gravely, "though I can't say I'm sorry." The man had no conscience. Still, it leaves one uneasy, doesn't it? Evil put to death never feels like a victory, only an ending. "Endings and victories rarely keep company," Miss Marple replied, "and I don't think Reed ever truly understood what he'd done. Men like that never believe they're villains, only that they've been forced into unpleasant necessities. It's a peculiar blindness." The vicar nodded thoughtfully. "You always manage to make sin sound so ordinary." She smiled faintly. "It usually is." After he left, she went to her writing desk, where a small stack of letters awaited her attention. One was from her nephew Raymond, asking when she meant to visit London. Another from an old friend in St. Mary's Mead's Women's Institute, inviting her to speak at their next meeting on observation and human nature. She chuckled softly at that and began to compose a polite reply. "It is a subject," she wrote, "best learned in gardens and drawing rooms, among people who believe they have nothing to hide." The evening deepened, and the fire sank low. Outside, the church bell tolled softly, its notes floating over the rooftops. Miss Marple rose and drew the curtains, glancing out once more at the village she knew so well. The streets were empty now, peaceful again, the green glistening faintly under the lamplight. Nothing in that view suggested the violence or deceit that had recently shadowed it. And yet, she thought, that was the very nature of human life, to hide its storms beneath calm surfaces, to mask the most desperate motives behind civility and charm. She turned back to the fire, her expression thoughtful but serene. The truth, after all, had been revealed. The dead had been given their justice, and the living their uneasy peace. The rest would fade into memory, as all such tragedies eventually did. But she, Jane Marple of St. Mary Mead, would remember. She always did. Before retiring, she opened her notebook, a small, neat volume filled with her fine handwriting, and jotted a few lines beneath the heading, "The Widow and the Choir Practice. Observation confirms, people seldom sin for novelty. They sin from habit, pride, fear, or need, and they repeat themselves in pattern as surely as the seasons. Greed masks itself as duty, deceit as protection, cruelty as concern. Only kindness, that most fragile of virtues, has no disguise." She closed the notebook gently and set it beside her reading lamp. Outside, the first nightingale of spring had begun to sing, its song clear and solitary in the crisp air. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her hands folded in her lap. "A village like any other," she murmured to herself. "And people, just the same as ever. Only the faces change." Then she rose, extinguished the lamp, and let the stillness of St. Mary Mead settle once more around her, a stillness that seemed, for the moment, perfectly complete. The mystery was finished, the peace restored, and Miss Marple, ever patient, ever observant, waited quietly for whatever small curious trouble life would bring her next.